Chapter 13. My first trip to the United States. It was a great event for the family to see my father and me off at the Yokohama Pier on August 15th, 1919. After hundreds and thousands of bowings, the SS Siberia Maru put to sea, leaving colorful serpentines and flowers and home people behind. I looked forward with great excitement and expectation to seeing the unknown land of the West, and I looked back at my homeland, thinking of my babies and my people. But I was cheerful and even gay. I had nothing to worry about. My first voyage taking place under the protection of my father, who, having been abroad many times and being accustomed to traveling, insisted on accompanying his daughter, whom he had brought up in the box, across the Pacific Ocean. He made this his pleasure trip to America to hand his daughter over safely to her husband. It was early morning when we approached the Golden Gate outside the harbor of San Francisco. Through the dim light of half-dawn, the city, with the twinkling window lights, looked like a fairyland, or like white castles of sugar with silver filings, which I used to see with childish admiration in the show windows of Western confectionery shops in Tokyo. "Oh, Father, America is here!" I exclaimed with joy. Then I continued to stand for a long time, trying to stamp these beautiful first impressions of a Western town on my memory. It was the realization of a dream to me, almost religious. To the Japanese people, planting their feet on the distant western shore is like a pilgrimage to the land of Buddha in ancient times. Our ancestors never thought, in those bygone days of pilgrimage, of crossing an ocean without first exchanging cups of water with their relatives as a sign that this departure was possibly an eternal farewell. So it was natural for me to be ecstatic when I first caught sight of America. I pinched my hand with my own fingers, and hurt. "So this is not a dream," I said to myself. Father laughed at my childish delight, while he looked after my passport and the trunks. The soft morning breeze caressed my hair as I gaily turned towards the floating land on the dark green water. September 1st, 1919, was the mark of my maturity, the day I first stepped on the great continent of North America, full of hope and enthusiasm. I felt serene joy like a bird's in the spring sky, but with this happiness went a serious determination to make this trip fully successful from an educational standpoint. After the 6 months' separation, to discover my husband among the Americans at the pier and to find him looking so well was a deep satisfaction. I did not miss the flush of strong will power in his bright eyes, which revealed his state of mind before he spoke a word to me. His lordly manner and his smartness in getting along in American ways helped me find my bearings while I was so overwhelmed by the rush and bigness of the American city, that I could only timidly exclaim, "What tall men! What big cars! What big horses! What wide streets!" Finally my husband said to me, "Don't say any more about the bigness of American things, for you won't see anything but what is big in this country." We took a room in an hotel in Berkeley, where I spent my first night in the West. The city, as well as all the hotels, were crowded, for President Wilson had arrived to inspect the United States Navy in San Francisco Bay. My days were spent in excitement and joy over the reunion with my husband, over interesting places to visit, and over the enjoyment of the California fruits and abundant ice cream. My husband talked to my father about what had impressed him in American civilization, and about what he thought of Japan compared with this Western country. He was still the idealist, anxious for the improvement of labor conditions at home. My father listened to him quietly and refrained from argument. He looked upon his son-in-law with a kind fatherly eye, as if he were wishing him not to go too far with his adventures, for the sake of the happiness of his family. These two men had both selected engineering for their professions, but one strictly limited his interest to the sphere of mechanical power, and the other proposed to utilize its productive power in the interest of general human happiness. I recognized a 1,000-mile gap between the father and the son-in-law, and I thought that in that distance lay the progress of the younger generation. On the 10th day of September, I arrived in New York. It was natural for a young woman to expect something wonderful and beautiful when she arrived at this center of the modern material civilization. Handsome hotels, with the most up-to-date accommodations, attractive stores and shopping quarters, and fashionable restaurants with tempting foods. I had expected such things to color my New York life, but this was not to be my lot. The place to which my husband had arranged to take his young wife was a shabby little boarding house in Upper Manhattan Avenue. When the Baron took me there in the late evening in a taxicab from the Pennsylvania station, a woman about 60 years old appeared at the door in a queer-looking white nightgown. Her pale face, which looked to me as if she had never seen sunlight, and her thin light hair standing up in the gloomy gaslight, made her appear like the wicked witch in a fairy tale my mother used to read to me from English books in my childhood. Ha ha! This must be a ghost house in America. My imagination instantly went back far to the memories of my early life. The woman spoke English, but with a strong accent which I could not understand at all, and I could only catch the word "sure, sure," often repeated in her conversation with my husband. My first night's sleep in New York was disturbed by strange bugs marching around my sheets and pillows. It was a great surprise for me to encounter Nanking bugs, as we call them in Japan, for we are told that these bugs were the undesirable souvenirs brought back by the Japanese soldiers from Manchuria after the Sino-Japanese War. I had the honor of beholding them for the first time in the great city of New York, far away from the old Chinese city of Nanking. In the morning, in the daylight, I found that the furniture in our room was dirty and cheap. My husband's notion of how we ought to live extended to our meals. He showed me how to get a pot full of hot coffee and a few pieces of corn muffin from a Sixth Avenue restaurant. For the first time in my life, I took a meal in such a manner, and fared miserably. Even in the simple existence at the mines, the atmosphere was different. Why should we select such a dirty place to live in? I had plenty of money in my bank account. I was miserable and unhappy. My father was staying at an hotel in Washington Square. Uncle Yasuki was also in New York, and several of our Japanese friends. None of them had the adventurous spirit of my honorable husband, nor chose to explore the slums in New York and to fight with bugs. Uncle Yasuki told me in a joking way that the Baron had become a Bolshevik. "That's that," I exclaimed to myself. "Aha! He has finally become a real one." This simple joke of my uncle's was enough to explain our strange way of living and our angle of vision in the Occident. A week after our arrival in New York, my husband took me to see Miss Carolyn Dow, the General Secretary and Dean of the YWCA Training School. He helped me to explain to her that I wished to enter the school, get professional training, and at the same time learn English in a short time. He also added that I wished to be self-supporting woman, as I did not believe in an easy life based on inherited fortune. So Miss Dow introduced me to the Ballard School at the YWCA building on Lexington Avenue. I registered for the secretarial course, which began October 1st. The work was so absorbing that I forgot all about my miserable room at the boarding house and became quite enthusiastic about my school life in America. From the kindergarten to the final graduation, my past education was limited to the Peeresses School, with its feudalistic air, so my experience in an American school training young women for trades and professions was novel in the extreme. I was surprised to find lessons started off without any ceremony. Teachers and students acted in a democratic and simple manner, which was quite unusual to me, who had been brought up among formalities. I was the only foreign student in the class, and teachers and students took a great interest in this Oriental girl who knew very little English, but who was bold enough to attend a class where Native Americans came to study shorthand, most of them having finished high school. Miss Louis Biederschoss was the teacher of stenography. She gave me a front seat, and I concentrated all my attention on her instruction. She was the best possible type of teacher, with a strict, precise, and energetic attitude towards her class. She knew how to make the snake-like shorthand a live thing in a girl's mind. She impressed me as a woman of strong character. I shall never forget her. Every day from 9 to 3, I worked in this school. I spent 2 hours in a typewriting course under Miss Boyd, who, pointing to a chart on the blackboard, would shout, "ASDF, LKJ," keeping time with a stick in her hand while some 40 girls pressed keyboards at her direction. This was easy work for a person like myself, who could play the piano, but some of the girls struggled desperately with their unwieldy fingers. For a month or two I could not speak a word at school. I was timid and did not dare to talk in the class, but I studied hard both there and at home. I spent 4 or 5 hours on my homework every day. At the end of the 3rd month, I began to understand most of what the teachers said. Miss Biederschoss watched me carefully, curious about the progress of a foreign student learning English and stenography at the same time. Although I had a strong determination for self-discipline and tried not to complain in any circumstances in which I was caught, I simply could not endure the boarding room in Bolshevik style, very much longer, and at the end of the first month I got my husband's consent to move to a little better place. He did not agree to my consulting anybody about this matter, but suggested that I should act independently. An independent action is quite contrary to my feudal training. At home I had to consult my elders even about washing my hair, but in America my husband tried to train me to act on my own initiative, so I put a little advertisement in a New York paper which read as follows: "A Japanese woman wants a room in an American family." A few days later, I received about a dozen offers, and I went out to see them. I found a clean small room far uptown at the junction of 157th Street and Broadway. The landlady was a Southerner, and both she and her husband were cultured, middle-class Americans. They had never taken a lodger before, but the fact that I was Japanese lured them into the adventure. My husband was called off to Washington and left me alone to execute the moving business all by myself. Independent action was not at all easy as yet. I missed my numerous servants, who gracefully bowed and waited on me whenever I needed them. I went out into the street and called an expressman. I prepared my short English sentences in my mind before I spoke to him, and my moving affair was carried out safely. I had arranged to pay £6 a month for the room and breakfast. As soon as I settled into this new room, I locked my door carefully and tried to sleep, but could not. I was frightened by strange emotions which kept me awake. I walked to the door again and again to see whether it really locked. I felt that only this frail piece of board was the fortress which protected me from the outside world and from strange people. During my life of 23 years, I had never lived alone like this, but usually in a big family. I missed my parents, who would never have left me in such a manner without a chaperone. I recalled the Chinese moral of the lioness, pushing her cubs over the top of a steep cliff to the bottom of the ravine to see whether they were strong enough to live in the jungle. My husband had thrown me out in the wilderness of human life, where I was unable to rely upon anybody else, but had to stand up firmly on my own feet. He arranged affairs so that I should not see any Japanese people while I was learning English. For months I never heard or spoke a word of my native language, and this close attention brought remarkable progress in my English within a short period. While I lived alone, ate alone, and studied alone day after day, my husband wrote me from Washington that he planned to go to Europe after Christmas. I comprehended, somewhat at least, his passionate zest for social experience and his ideals, to which I paid deep respect. But when I thought of my domestic life, dark premonitions threw a shadow on the future. I was not told much about his European plan, but I knew of the Baron's interest in New Russia, and said to myself that his trip to Europe was like the one on which Abraham went out without knowing where he should go. His firm determination to do something extraordinary could be read in his lines. This trip may be my eternal farewell to you. If so, be brave, always, and grow to be a faithful worker for the betterment of the Japanese women's lot. He later wrote, "I will watch your growth as that of a representative woman of Japan. If the women of a nation stay on a low level, there is no progress in that nation as a whole. I am interested in what my friend said to me about the downfall of the great Roman Empire, because my friend attributed it to the Roman women who stopped growing physically and intellectually. If the women of Japan remain on the same level as they are today and don't work to improve their intellect and their physique, there won't be any glory to the future of Japan. I pondered on these words of my husband's and accepted them, but how could I accept this proposal of separation? I again and again asked him to take me with him, even to the limit of the earth. I will endure any hardship with you, as I vowed to myself when I was engaged to you. I promised. Are you going to miss your only chance to study? He asked me. Is it your idea to cling to me all the rest of your life? Don't you want to make yourself useful to society? I could not answer him, but his attitude confirmed my determination to remain in the United States until I had finished my course at school. I must study. I must be a self-supporting woman, I repeated to myself, and I did not ask him any more to take me to Europe with him. Baron Ishimoto came back to New York from Washington and spent the Christmas vacation with me. He was scheduled to sail for Stockholm on January 3rd. The day for his departure came so quickly. It was a bright but cold morning. I went out with my husband as far as the corner of the street and said goodbye to him, there, with a desperate effort to control myself from bursting into a flood of tears. I had been preparing myself to behave bravely, as the daughter of a samurai should do, and so I did it fairly well, but as I ran back to my room, I felt as if I had lost everything in the world. I cried and cried, to my heart's content. The landlady, Miss Nelson, who had been cleaning her breakfast plates, came up to my room to find me on the bed, and embarrassed me by saying, "Sweet child, I know you don't like to let him go." She left her work unfinished in the kitchen, put on her coat and hat, and put on mine for me. Then she took me off to a Hoboken pier to see my husband again. I found him among the Swedish passengers, and said goodbye over and over again until the whistle blew. It was a fearfully cold winter day. My tears and my snivel froze. Feet, hands, and cheeks were aching in the bitter wind. Miss Nelson took me back home and fed me with hot chicken soup. She was kind and attentive, but my lonely soul was inconsolable. When school reopened after the vacation, I somewhat forgot myself and began to study hard once more. I must study. I must be a self-supporting woman. This I held constantly in my mind. The winter in New York was severe. Heavy snow often stopped the traffic on the street, and laborers toiled to move the solid snowbanks. I caught cold and had to stay in bed for several days. This nourished the misery of terrible homesickness. There was nothing to soothe my lonely heart, nothing in my small square room in Miss Nelson's apartment, facing the white walls and with the white ceiling on my head all day long. I longed for my mother's tender voice and the warm inquiries about my health, for soft-boiled rice, coddled eggs, and sweet plums on trays. While I was in bed, I read the autobiography, named one of them, written by a Russian girl Elizabeth Hassanovitz. This girl, leaving her poverty-stricken family, came to the United States as an immigrant and worked in an American shop for trifling wages. One time she too was sick and lay in her cold little bed without friends or family about her, only an empty purse under her pillow for company. She wrote about the miserable life of a factory girl who had to struggle against greedy bosses and icy-hearted employers. After reading it, I said to myself, what is the matter with me? Born to abundance and choosing this lonely place, only at my own will to make myself stronger, stand up bravely. I did not catch cold, nor was I attacked by illness after that. It happened during those days that my God of Fortune brought me an opportunity to meet Margaret Sanger, one of the greatest women of the world today. My husband had previously introduced me to Agnes Smedley, who had been a co-worker with Miss Sanger early in her birth control agitation. She took me to see Margaret Sanger, in whom I had been deeply interested. Our meeting was on the afternoon of January 17th, 1920, Miss Sanger having arranged a tea party for me to meet her and a few friends. Her work, her fascinating career in fighting for her cause, had made me picture her in my mind as a big woman of manly proportions. Quite contrary to my imagination, when she received me at the door of her studio, I saw a delicate little figure with the charm of a thoroughly feminine type. Still, her strong will-power was evident in her bright, shining eyes, and her thick, shining hair gave a touch of eternal youth to her appearance. I felt instantly her magnetism, and my respect for her deepened as she talked about her difficulties. Listening to her account of the birth control movement, the memory of the overcrowded miners' huts in western Japan came back so vividly that the idea of my true mission in life flashed over me. Yes, Miss Sanger's fight has to be fought in my country too. I will carry the banner for birth control in Japan. However, I knew myself better than anybody else. I knew that I did not have Margaret Sanger's courage. I must cultivate courage in my character. Courage would come from knowledge and conviction. While I was studying, I paid no attention to current events in the world at large, but concentrated on my work. Many Japanese of my own class lived in New York, in comfortable apartments, enjoying drives, theaters, and golf matches, and fashionable dresses, but I maintained my simple life in the Nelsons' apartment. As I loved music, I went to the Metropolitan Opera House once in a while, taking a seat on the top floor, from which I looked down on the luxurious boxes and orchestra seats, packed with people in evening clothes, wearing diamonds, and carrying ostrich fans. Enrico Caruso, the most popular tenor, looked like an ant on the stage, though his world-famous voice was well heard, even close to the roof where I sat. When spring came back to New York, and green leaves began to enrich the trees in Central Park and Riverside Drive, I added more and more to my vocabulary of English, and commenced to transcribe shorthand letters on the typewriter. I could understand and speak English well enough to make friends among Americans at the end of the school term. Miss Ballard, the chairman of the school, and Miss Bider-Haas, my teacher, were pleased to find that their foreign student had made such progress during that short period of time. Though I finished the course, I was unable to remain until speech day. I was actually going to join my husband in Europe. Before I left, however, the school kindly arranged a little gathering in my honor, and a certificate was presented to me, decorated with white flowers. It stated as follows: the Ballard School for Practical Education, Central Branch, Young Women's Christian Association of the City of New York. This is to certify that Shidzue Ishimoto has satisfactorily completed the prescribed work as indicated. Subject: stenography, number of hours 320, grade A. Bookkeeping, 20 hours, grade A. Secretarial duties, 40 hours, grade A. Typewriting, 320 hours, grade A. Signed by the chairman and director, May 28, 1920. There is nothing to make a person happier than the consciousness of having accomplished something one is set out to do, even though it be such a trifle as to finish one's embroidery in a frame, or to pick fresh tomatoes from the garden after toiling in the soil with one's own hands to grow them. To me, the winning of this certificate seemed like gaining an invaluable treasure. I had struggled through the long winter, battling with loneliness. An inner voice whispered triumphantly, "Now you can be a self-supporting woman, whenever you wish to." My classmates at the school acquired positions in various business firms, some for $18 and some for $25 a week, at the start of their careers as private secretaries, while I began to pack my trunks for the trip to Europe. Chapter 14. My husband's disillusionment over Christian humanism. My trip to the United States of America is, I should say, more my enlightenment than for sightseeing merely. Baron Ishimoto wrote in his notebook of random thoughts, "It is an occasion of consecutive spiritual awakenings for me, if I explain it in the term of Zennism, discovering a truth about life yesterday, and today getting another gleam of wisdom. This period of self-analysis is as revealing as my first reading of the Holy Bible. This short description of my husband's mental state indicates directly and frankly the turn in his life which the visit to the United States had brought about. Christian humanism had been building up his character. His belief in the Christian religion had sprung from the influence of Mr. Konzo Uchimura, a prominent Christian leader in Japan, and from the liberalism of Dr. Inonzo Nitobe. My husband combined Christian humanism and modern liberalism beautifully in his character and action. It was this intellectual idealism which led him to select mining as his profession in order to gain contact with laborers, and his direct experience with physical labor and his familiarity with mining as a whole raised doubts in his mind about the excellence of the capitalistic system of industry. He carried his questions in his mind across the Pacific Ocean to the American continent. His purpose in coming to the United States was to study capitalism more widely and to seek answers to his philosophical problems. He hoped to reach conviction by this large experience, just as in his early youth he had overcome many of his doubts by reading the Bible and becoming a disciple of Christ. While he was in America, he acted as though he had completely forgotten that he was an engineer connected with the Mitsui Company, the big capitalist concern. Soon after he reached the West, He was sent to Mexico to inspect the metal mines in that country. While he was there, he happened to meet some American socialists who had crossed the border to agitate in Mexico. He met and talked with still more radical men. He discloses the effect of his association with them in his notebook. I visited William Haywood at the headquarters of the IWW. Haywood started his career as a metal miner. His gigantic constitution, his impressive one eye, and his charming personality reminds me of our great Shidzue na Shu. Shidzue was one of the great men who, at the time of the Meiji Restoration, contributed much to the emperor's cause. Later, a group of his former followers who opposed the policies of the central government organized a revolt. Convinced of their sincerity of purpose, Shidzue left his position of glory and honor in the government to join their uprising, was defeated, as he had expected to be, and committed suicide. Nevertheless, a monument to him was erected in Ueno Park, in the center of Tokyo, to commemorate his earlier generosity and loyalty. My husband's notebook continued. Haywood said, "Workers should be united. Not only within one nation, but the workers of the world must unite. Industry must be democratized, not only within one nation, but the industries of the world must be democratized by the people." I agree with his idea of the industrial workers of the world. He also added in his notes that William Haywood was far different from the pedantic socialist we often found in cities, talking wildly but never working with sincerity for the attainment of their goal. The interviews and discussions in Mexico intensified my husband's unrest. Later in New York, he became acquainted with Sen Katayama, the forerunner of the Japanese socialist, who was invited afterwards to Soviet Russia and honored there until his death. At the time of which I speak, Sen Katayama was in New York consoling himself for persecution in his native land by writing a history of the Japanese labor movement. When my husband planned to get into Soviet Russia, Mr. Katayama gave him letters of introduction to Lenin, Trotsky, and other comrades. Moving steadily to the left, my husband's Christian humanism paled in the face of his radical economic convictions. However, his fundamental belief in Jesus Christ remained, even if he did doubt the efficacy of Christianity in furthering social reform. He wrote again, "The decline of Christianity today may be explained by the fact that it does not touch the point of common interest of humankind. If I may be permitted to express the doctrine of Jesus Christ in one word, it'll be charity. The doctrine of Shinran, one of the saints in Japanese Buddhism, is the same charity. Yet the forces which affect us are charity, hunger, and beauty, man's response to them being based on his ego. We pursue beauty, we go to one who gives charity, and we seek one who heals hunger. I recall the wonderful work of Jesus Christ, who fed thousands of hungry people in the wilderness. Charity and beauty are one. Religion interprets beauty as charity, and art interprets charity as beauty. If there were no chapter in the Bible about the feeding of thousands in the wilderness, or the chapter of Moses receiving manna in the barren field, the Bible would be nothing. It is Moses and St. Francis who demonstrated charity to us. It is Rodin and Whitman who show us beauty, and it is Karl Marx and the working people of today who emphasize the need of bread. People who concern themselves with religion today do not comprehend the true charity. Thus the glory of religion has receded naturally. It was a natural outcome of Baron Ishimoto's growing social ideas that he should live and take me to live in that slum-like place. On my arrival 6 months after his in New York, when I arrived, his first comments on the city of New York were like this: "The vast population is not the pride of the city of New York. The skyscrapers are not the greatness of New York. It cannot be found in the prosperity of commerce. The pride of New York is found, I should say, in Rodin's original sculptures, which the city of New York possesses, and whose number is incomparably greater than that of any other big city of the world." I did not understand at first what he meant, but later, when he took me to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I understood. As we reached the statue La Peinture, he stopped for a while and said, "I find something prophetic in this work of art. The future of human society must be the world in which the man of labor and the man of thought coincide." I realized that his philosophy was changing. My husband's enthusiasm as a social reformer was evident in his effort during the first labor conference in Washington in the autumn of 1919. He helped in every way he could the Japanese labor delegate, Mr. Yu Masumoto, and his advisors, Messrs. Oshima and Domei, who were all industrial laborers, and had difficulties in the foreign land, owing to their lack of knowledge of English. He stayed in Washington during the entire time of the conference at his own expense, to render this aid, although he knew that these delegates were selected officially by the government, ignoring the will of labor organizations, and that the method of selection had met strong criticism at home among the laborers themselves. My husband knew the circumstances of their appointment, and he did not approve of the process. By coming to a distant country, if they could not accomplish anything, the Baron felt that the shame would be a heavy burden to all the laborers of Japan. Therefore he dared to offer his services and give them valuable suggestions, notably about the 8-hour day system of labor. During his activities at the Washington Labor Conference, the manager of the Mitsui Bussan Company gently warned my husband that his support of the laborers would militate against future promotion in the dominion of Mitsui capitalism. The manager was informed that the Baron acted in accordance with what he believed. My husband said, "If I don't declare the truth, a stone will declare it." He had made up his mind during these days that he would resign from his position in the Mitsui Company and would work for the happiness of mankind in general. He jotted down in his notebook his thoughts on this matter. "O God, let thy faithful servant work for the happiness of the common people of my country. My service in helping the delegates at the Washington Labor Conference is a mere trifle, but I have studied labor problems for 10 years, and am now of the firm conviction that the social position of the laboring class must be elevated. I shall not worry about my personal relations with the Mitsui Company or with my people. I shall fight for the laborers." He then turned to me and explained, "If everybody else fails to understand my struggles, you will understand them, Shidzue." This he said to me before he left New York for Washington to attend the conference. Resolving to act and acting may be two very different things, however. He suffered in thinking over his position in relation to his family. He could not deny that he was the son of a former minister of war and the present master of an honorable titled family. All the other members of his family were in high social positions. His brothers held official posts in the government or were in military service. How could he cut himself off from his contacts with the people of his class? What would happen to his beloved wife if a revolution took place in her husband's life? O God, bless my soul. Make me thy faithful servant to work for the happiness of the common people. Give me courage to open a path through the road of thorns." Thus he prayed. When struggling desperately, he realized the difficulties connected with shaking off the traditional fetters of the old feudal family system. He even felt a temptation to retire into a remote mountain and live his life alone and quietly. Sometimes he wished that he had died while he was a carefree boy, unaware of the bitterness which life can hold. These turns of inner conflict indicate that Baron Ishimoto has a good and honest nature. When moments calling for action presented themselves, his sentimental indecision was swept away, and his heart and soul were filled with an indomitable spirit. While he was in Washington helping the labor delegates, he determined to visit Soviet Russia. He came back to New York with his hope swelling. He cried, "I am now going to Russia." I left the land of the rising sun for the United States of America in February 1919, with a determination which was epoch-making in my life, and now I am to make another trip based on another decision, equally epoch-making, but more serious and profound. I expect to visit the Scandinavian countries, and then Soviet Russia. My soul is leaping with thrills and expectation over what I shall observe there. The whole world has been affected by the World War. The new union of the Soviet Socialist Republics is the only fruitful creation of the World War to remain for posterity, whose hope depends entirely on the success or failure of that new attempt at liberation. I expect to meet Lenin and Trotsky, who are carrying out the socialism which has shaken the world since Karl Marx advanced the new idea. I shall see the outcome of the 2 years since the revolution. How could I help my heart's leaping with anticipation? I shall put through this program of mine in any circumstances or at any sacrifice. It was not Christian humanism that brought my husband to this extreme faith in Soviet Russia. Experiences in the United States had refashioned his thinking. On board the SS Frederick VIII, his jotting down of ideas continued. Frederick VIII is sailing on the rough winter sea of the Atlantic for Northern Europe. It is the time for me to review my year's sojourn in the United States. It was a year of great significance for me, because of the change in my thought. Shall I simply call it a great change in my thought or is it the discovery of an entirely new idea? I have learned that the history of humankind is founded on ego. My work as a social reformer rests on ego. I see love grounded on ego. My philosophy stands on this ground of ego. I have observed America and am to study Europe and Soviet Russia in relation to ego. Thus he concluded. The moving age was claiming its own, but the Baron's planned to see Russia, despite his great determination to carry it out, and although he had appropriate letters of introduction from the Socialist of America and Sen Katayama, was firmly checked. The first obstacle was the relation of Soviet Russia with other European nations. The second was the interference with his journey by the Japanese legations in Europe. And the third was his title. He could have managed to cut through the obstacles of the first and the third, but the second source of interference hindered him, openly or privately, until he was compelled to give up his plan completely. I wept for him when I received his letter, in which he expressed his disappointment. After he realized that no effort could succeed, he changed his course through the continent to England, his heart utterly broken. On the road of life one makes crossings which cannot be retraced. If one takes the north path instead of the south, one's future is completely different from what it would have been if one had taken the south instead of the north. My husband had tried desperately to enter Russia, offering to sacrifice social position, even his wife and his children. His failure at that time was to him a tragedy. Had he succeeded in his heroic attempt to see his utopia, however, I might never have seen him again. The iron bars of a jail would be waiting for him in Japan if he wished to return home. Sympathizers with communism are severely persecuted in Japan, but a hero can seldom be a hero all his life. My hero, who tried hard to be constant in his conviction, never thrilled me again by such a brave attempt. I still regret the misfortune which checked his battle for suffering humanity. Chapter 15. My Trip to Europe. The summer voyage on the Atlantic Ocean was pleasant. The mirror-like waters extended over the wide space between the two continents, like a large glass floor. My heart was light as a skylark's in the May air. I cherished my little certificate, given by the Business Training School of New York, thinking how pleased my husband would be to see proof of my serious effort. I planned to be an efficient secretary to him, so that he would no longer consider me a helpless parasitical woman. Yes, I was independent now, and I should act on my own initiative, using my own judgment. My ship dropped anchor at Southampton on June 4th. I expected a passionate embrace from my husband, and the joy of reunion after another 6-month separation, marked by hardships on both sides, but his expression was cold. He received me as if it were a matter of business. My heart almost ceased beating from disappointment. I wished I had remained in the United States, cherishing my illusion of his love for me and his heroic determination to serve humanity. However, I expressed my deepest sympathy with him in his defeat with respect to the Russian visit, and tried to be companionable, but his disappointment ran too deep for the consolation of affection. It had changed entirely his character. We decided to spend our time in Europe for recreation and pleasure, in sightseeing and art pilgrimages. We stayed 2 months, visiting England, France, Switzerland, and Italy together. But our eyes did not in fact turn only on art. Everywhere the post-war social unrest and distress were apparent. In England, the shortage of food was still acute. We Japanese were used to a dearth of food at home, but after a long sojourn in the United States, I had acquired the habit of living with plenty. In Europe, restaurants furnished poor meat and vegetables at high prices, and sugar and butter were strictly limited for each person. A dose of powdered sugar was all that we could get for a cup of tea. Among the Japanese at home, where Western clothes and the use of English were supposed to be an indication of things up to date, one frequently heard the jovial remark, "In the West, even beggars wear Western clothes, and babies speak English." Now, looking about us in London, we saw long rows of unemployed, and beggars standing on the corners of the streets, miserably and inadequately dressed. My husband, who had been depressed by Germany's suffering after the war, assured me that it was not so acute in England, yet we found a great deal of misery among the victorious Allies. It was deeply affecting to encounter veterans in ragged old clothes, being wheeled in chairs along the paths of different parks by the shabbily clad relatives, ribbon decorations tragically testifying to their heroism at the front. What did the war really bring to mankind? Was it glory? Was it riches? Nothing, it seemed, but the tremendous destruction of civilization and the irreparable loss of human life and material wealth. There was no contentment or exultation anywhere. Physically, the city of London was beautiful in June. The stroll along the Thames brought exotic pleasure to us foreigners. Spiritually, however, we felt starved. The peace and charm of the water could not compensate for the constant reminders of war and its horrors. On our walk, one day along the embankment, a middle-aged man in tattered garments dragged his heavy steps towards us and exclaimed in a crazy tone, "Who made me so useless?" His complexion was dull, the color of mud, and his eyes blazed wildly. On his breast was a medal, indicating his valor in battle. Again and again, as he shuffled along, he uttered the same cry, "Who made me so useless?" We saw another man powerfully built, with a deep chest, apparently a laborer, sitting on a bench with a little child, which was sobbing bitterly. The man nursed his baby in his best, if awkward manner, but it kept up its wailing to his great perplexity. We drew near him, and doubtless our solicitude was obvious. The man glanced at us with a strange expression and said, "It's not new to me, madame, to be acting as a nurse, but this little rascal cries ridiculously." "Your wife?" I continued to ask him. "She works. I'm a veteran, unemployed." The women of England seemed less tragic to me, even well off. Now they could vote. While we were there, Lady Askeith and other women mingled with men in political campaigns, making speeches and answering questions from the platform, showing their active ability and intellectual equality with men. As a traveler from a country whose women were so behind in their social position, owing to their persistent feudal background, my surprise and admiration were boundless. In all the Western countries where I observed these feminist activities, I associated them with strong physiques, and came to conclusions concerning the need of physical development among the women of Japan, from the delicate gracefulness to healthy and strong constitutions, if they were to hope for true elevation in their intellectual and social status. While we were in London, we had an interview with Mr. G.D.H. Cole, the young Guild socialist whose literary works had been introduced to Japan. My husband asked him many questions about conditions in England, and his answers explained, to a great extent, what we as foreign observers had found so puzzling. Does the younger generation of England have sympathy with New Russia? My husband asked Mr. Cole immediately. The reply was a simple and emphatic yes. The next question had to do with civil liberty in England, especially free speech. Why was it that England, by all appearances, was more liberal in this matter than the United States, France, and other Western countries? Would England remain liberal? And Mr. Cole maintained that the English people were less excitable, less hysterical by nature than other peoples, the result being that radicals could agitate or speak as they liked. He added, however, that England was speedily swinging in the radical direction. Consequently, the government was adopting precautions, such as an increase in the number of policemen and their training in rifle practice, the enlargement of the spy system, and the encouragement of voluntary police organizations. Mr. Cole's reference to the policemen made a highly ironic impression on us, since we hadn't grown up in a Christian atmosphere and were used to the idea of warlords. The idea of brotherly love had gripped us as we became adults with the full force of novelty, no less than idealism. But here, in London churches and policemen were the twin features of a city. The churches gave color to London, suggesting its historical background and emphasizing its religion. But we wondered why this city of Christian churches and civilized people reared in Christian principles could keep order only with many policemen. This was not true of any pagan country. More completely, I was lost in the charms of Paris. We stayed in a fashionable hotel on the Champs-Élysées, where the early summer breeze carried sweet fragrance from chestnut leaves, and devoted our time to visiting art museums and places of beauty. Putting aside our interest in social and political questions, we spent our days in an atmosphere of painting, sculpture, and natural loveliness, and the hours ran out swiftly. At the Mikey Coal Mines, we used to study Western art at home, second-hand, by means of photographs, now in the presence of the original works. We were delighted. We also enjoyed the opera and the theater in Paris, although we had been unmoved by either in other Western cities, because our eyes and ears were trained for the classical, no drama, and kabuki theater. During our stay in Paris, we consciously tried not to touch upon social questions. However, one day we left this city of art behind us and went to Reims. Our deeper interests were revived. Surely no militarist would ever have courage to start war again if they could see the destruction so starkly and appallingly presented here. The fine old cathedral buildings, houses, the pavement of the streets, and even the trees riddled with bullets and shattered by bombs and shells, made one think of a broken nest of bees. We saw miles and miles of trenches in which soldiers had tried to protect themselves, while they were resisting or advancing on the enemy. The exhaustion of the warring nations became more comprehensible, with military, economic, mental, and physical strength, all bent on this devastating struggle. It was clear, even then, that if mankind had to fight again, it would fight with more scientific machinery and under more complicated international relations. The next war would be still more cruel, woeful, and tenacious in reaching the final catastrophic decision. It was not war alone that shocked us. The aftermath seemed equally dreadful. We were greatly moved by these terrific sights of Reims and its vicinities. We left these tragic districts and stayed a day in the quiet old French town of Chalons, then followed on to Strasbourg in the heart of Alsace-Lorraine. Young school children of that city told us that they were taught French when France ruled the region, and German when Germany possessed the land. Why must nations teach even small children to hate their neighbors? What were the Christian churches preaching to them? Those were the questions which occupied our minds while we traveled through these districts, scarred with the ravages of many previous wars. Mountain climbing came as a relief to our spiritual agony. At home I had never thought of climbing Mount Fuji, but now that I had been educated in America to be independent and energetic, I decided to climb the Jungfrau with my husband. I was warned again and again that it was too much strain for a woman who had never climbed high mountains, but I did not listen. We started together from the Jungfrau Jacques, binding our bodies with rope, my husband going ahead, I in the middle, and the mountain guide behind us. I managed to get along very well, and we reached the summit of the mountain after 3 hours' hard struggling in the snow. The gorgeous view with which I was rewarded made me rejoice that I had taken the risks of the ascent. Descending, however, was a different matter. I felt suddenly tired, and halfway down I was so exhausted that I could not walk any more. I fell. Another step forward, and again I fell in the deep snow. A thundering headache attacked me, and my heart beat rapidly. But I was told that in the mountain snow, no one had excess energy for carrying another. Everybody had to walk by himself. If he couldn't, he had to be left to freeze. It was like the road of human life, where one has to live on his own strength. One has to be independent, to be born by one's own vitality, and to die alone. Stumbling at every step, I finally arrived safely at the place from which we had started in the morning. I was utterly exhausted. I fainted with the headache and heart trouble, but I recovered the following day. The loveliness of the country and the peacefulness of vast spaces helped me to recuperate. I especially loved the sound of the ringing bells, hung on the necks of the cows in the hillside pastures. With our faces, necks, and arms snow-burned and brown, with the thin skin peeling from our red noses, my husband and I continued our tour. Every traveler who has once gone through the Simplon Tunnel knows the remarkable contrast between Switzerland and Italy. In Switzerland, we saw people living, not in luxury and gaiety particularly, but in comfort and contentment, so far as we could judge. But immediately across the border, we at once noticed the great congestion. Our first impression of Italy was one of a superabundance of people. The landscape presented everywhere the sight of babies' clothes hanging on the lines around crowded houses. The resemblance to our own overpopulated nation in the East almost made us homesick. Overpopulation, poor natural resources, and the great gulf between the rich and the poor have made Italy a good nursery for social problems. We had heard much about the difficulties Italy was facing at that time, but when we arrived at Milan, we discovered we were not really prepared for what we saw. People looked tired, underfed. They wore tattered clothes. Even the horses were gaunt and weary. Human beings had to eat first, and it was natural that animals should wait until their masters were fed. Waiters were striking in Milan, and all the restaurants were closed, a great inconvenience to foreigners who could not speak Italian and who had to hunt for good food at grocers. We ate anything we could find, but for some reason we missed the famous national dish, macaroni. Strikes of every kind were going on in Italy. In Rome, all the tram cars were out of service, and some of the carriage drivers had joined the motormen. Workers refused to transport munitions for any reason. A general strike was being advocated. The question of Fiume was like a firebrand. Mussolini and his fascists were preparing their march on Rome, and Italy appeared to have no government. The leaders of the Social Democratic Party, unable to point the way out of misery, had lost their control over laborers, who were in a desperate plight. In these circumstances, the rise of the fascist movement, as the final crutch for the falling capitalist power, was unavoidable. This was a great lesson to us. We had to rush our sightseeing in Rome because we were afraid that the strikers might make traveling impossible for an indefinite period. Nevertheless, we visited the Vatican, the Colosseum, and other historical places and buildings. Rome made Western history live for us. Her architecture and her art deeply impressed us, but we were most powerfully struck by the great power of the Catholic Church, controlling immense numbers of people, regardless of their nationality or language, extending its power and influence even into politics, thoroughly coloring the life and history of the West. Church and state are kept so rigidly distinct and apart in Japan that we were amazed at the contrast. Leaving Rome with its historic monuments, commemorating the great imperialism built on the blood of slaves, we returned for a farewell visit to Paris, and then sailed from Havre to New York. Our memories of our European trip, a compound of sweetness and bitterness. After visiting these countries in Europe, my husband expressed his conclusions briefly. The currents of the world are strong. One is moving from good to better, guided by the inexperienced hands of the proletariat in the face of domestic and foreign opposition. The other is moving from bad to worse, the conventional road to destruction. Egypt and Rome all over again. My own conclusion was largely that travel is the best university in the world. Reaching New York, we took the Canadian route to Seattle and sailed for home after a year's absence for me and a year and a half for my husband. It is always exciting for a traveler to see his native land after a long absence from it. I was especially eager to see my two little sons and my parents, but on the other hand, both my husband and myself could not avoid feeling vaguely depressed at the thought of the heavy fetters of tradition awaiting us, to bind us again to the past. The invisible but powerful feudal bondage loomed quite beyond the movement of the world. How shall we fight against this power? Was the question we asked ourselves on our way across the Pacific.